Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a fascinating tale from the heart of Greek mythology that will take us from beauty to beast, from divine love to a tragic curse. We're talking about Medusa, the infamous monster with snakes for hair, whose gaze turned anyone she looked at into stone. But she wasn't always this way. She didn't just wake up one morning with a head full of snakes and the power to petrify. Oh no, it's a lot more complicated and a lot more tragic. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're listening from, so feel free to drop your city and the time in the comments. It's always fun to know how far this story is reaching. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medusa wasn't always the horrifying figure she's become in modern imagination. In fact, she was once a beautiful mortal woman, renowned for her stunning features. She had the kind of beauty that could stop you in your tracks, long golden hair, perfect features, and a gaze that could capture anyone's attention. But like all Greek myths, beauty came with its own dangers. Medusa's beauty was so mesmerizing, so irresistible, that it became her downfall. Before we dive into the drama of what went wrong, let's take a quick look at the backdrop of ancient Greece. Beauty wasn't just a physical trait, it was often a divine gift. Many Greek myths feature beautiful women who are either goddesses or cursed by gods. And Medusa? Well, she was no exception. She was a priestess in the temple of Athena, which meant she was sworn to celibacy and, in theory, untouched by love. But as we all know, fate rarely follows the rules. This is where things get a bit messy. Enter Poseidon, the mighty god of the sea. You might think of him as this noble figure after all. He ruled over the oceans and had the power to calm storms or stir up tsunamis. But his tastes, let's just say they weren't always appropriate. One day, Poseidon saw Medusa, and like many before him, he was entranced by her beauty. But instead of admiring her from afar, he did what gods do, because they took what he wanted. And here's where things take a turn. Medusa, who was supposed to be a sacred priestess, ended up in the temple, where Poseidon took her against her will. In many versions of the myth, it's made clear that this was not a consensual encounter. Medusa, trapped in a temple meant to be her sanctuary, couldn't escape. The temple, once a place of purity, became the scene of this terrible act. Now the fun part, or rather, the not-so-fun part is how Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, reacts to all of this. You'd think Athena would be sympathetic to Medusa, right? After all, Medusa was a victim here. But no, Athena decides to take a rather extreme action. Instead of punishing Poseidon, Athena curses Medusa. She transforms the beautiful woman into a hideous creature with snakes for hair, and anyone who gazes upon her will instantly turn to stone. Think about that for a second. Imagine being punished for something you had no control over, something that wasn't your fault at all. In Athena's eyes, Medusa's beauty was no longer something to be revered. It became something to be feared and shunned. This twist, where Medusa goes from a beautiful priestess to a monstrous creature, really speaks to how women were often depicted in ancient myths. Beauty, in many stories, was a double-edged sword. It could elevate you, but it could also lead to your downfall. And Medusa's story is a perfect example of how that beauty, in the eyes of the gods, became a curse. But let's not forget, Medusa's story isn't all about victimhood. Sure, she's cursed, but this curse also gives her a kind of power. She's no longer just a beautiful woman waiting to be admired. She's someone to be feared. Medusa becomes a symbol of danger, and while it's tragic, it's also empowering in its own twisted way. She's taken control of her fate, even if it means becoming a monster in the eyes of others. Still, there's something inherently tragic about it all. Medusa wasn't born a monster. She wasn't even evil. She was just a victim of the gods' whims. And now, she's a prisoner of her own curse, trapped in a form she never asked for, with a power that only isolates her further from the world she once belonged to. Now that you've had a moment to settle into Medusa's transformation, let's take a closer look at what this all meant for her. Once she became the monstrous creature with snakes for hair, Medusa was no longer part of the world she once knew. She became a symbol of fear and outcast, hidden away from civilization, forced to live in isolation, far from the temple where she had once served Athena. But how did this change impact her? Was there any hope left in her, or was she doomed to remain a terror of the ancient world? We often forget how deeply ancient Greeks believed in fate, and how their gods meddled in the lives of mortals. Medusa's story, like so many other myths, illustrates how those in power, especially the gods, could change someone's life with a snap of their fingers or, in her case, a single curse. But Medusa didn't just accept her fate. Oh no, she didn't quietly fade into the background. Instead, she learned to live with the power of her curse. First, let's talk about the snakes. Picture it for a moment. Medusa's once beautiful golden hair now writhes with snakes. It must have been an unbearable sight not just for others who gazed upon her, but for herself as well. Imagine the kind of isolation that would bring. She couldn't step outside without being a danger to everyone around her. She couldn't look into a mirror or even dare look at another living being without turning them into stone. It's like a twisted form of loneliness, the kind where you're so far removed from the world that you don't even have the option to connect with others. But here's the thing. Medusa didn't just sit there and cry about it. No, she adapted. Over time, she learned how to harness the power of her curse. Rather than seeing it as a punishment, she made it her weapon. After all, who would dare approach a woman who could turn them into stone with a single glance? No one. Medusa's new form became her shield, and it's one that kept everyone away from her. She might have been alone, but she wasn't weak. That doesn't mean it was all power and control, though. Medusa's situation was far from ideal. Her isolation must have been excruciating. Yet, it's important to note that her transformation gave her a level of autonomy that many mortals, and even gods, didn't have. In some ways, she was freer than most because no one dared challenge her. She had the power to defend herself in a world where women were often at the mercy of men and gods alike. And yet, despite her newfound power, Medusa remained a tragic figure. She had been a beautiful woman, one who was admired and respected. Now, she was a grotesque monster, feared by all, avoided at all costs. The irony is painful. She never wanted this power. She never asked for the snakes, the stone-cold stares, or the endless solitude. The gods had given her this curse, and she had no choice but to make the best of it. It's important to recognize that Medusa's curse wasn't a simple punishment. It was, in many ways, a comment on the treatment of women in ancient mythology. Beauty was both a gift and a burden, and once Medusa's beauty became something that could be feared, she was no longer seen as a woman to be admired. She was a woman to be feared. And as time went on, that fear turned to legend. Medusa, the woman who could turn you into stone, became something more than a myth. She became a symbol of power in a world where women's voices were often silenced. But, of course, this isn't where Medusa's story ends. In fact, the next phase of her journey introduces one of the most famous heroes in Greek mythology, the one who will eventually be tasked with killing her. But before we get to that part, let's pause and reflect on the powerful irony of Medusa's situation. A woman who was once admired for her beauty, turned into a monster, now becomes the subject of countless tales. She has gone from a victim to a symbol of strength and fear. What does that say about how power shifts in the world of Greek myths? Does the power to destroy also bring the power to be remembered? Now, as we sit here in the quiet, wondering about Medusa's transformation and how it shaped her into the figure we all know today, we can't ignore one important factor: how the gods treated their own creations. Medusa was cursed by Athena, yes, but it was Poseidon, the god of the sea, who had set this entire thing in motion. And that's where things get even more complicated. Poseidon, one of the most powerful gods in Greek mythology, had chosen Medusa for his own desires. And yet, it was Medusa who was punished, not him. She became the scapegoat in a divine love triangle that would forever alter her life. But let's not linger too long on the unfairness of it all. Greek mythology is full of instances where gods do as they please, with little regard for the lives of mortals. Medusa's curse, like many others, serves as a reminder of the whims of the gods. They gave her beauty, and they took it away. They gave her a voice, and then silenced it. And what was left in its place? A fearsome creature who could petrify anyone she looked at. It's funny, isn't it, how in many of these myths, beauty becomes both a gift and a burden. Medusa's beauty had been the key to her downfall, and the very thing that had attracted Poseidon's attention turned into her curse. But even in this monstrous form, there's an undeniable power. Medusa could control her destiny in a way that few mortals ever could. After all, no one would dare get too close to her. No one would dare cross her path. The power to turn someone to stone with just a glance? That's not something you'd easily forget. But, of course, it's a power that came at an immense cost. And this brings us to the next chapter of Medusa's life or isolation. Left to live in a cave far from civilization, Medusa's story is one of complete seclusion. She went from being a priestess in Athena's temple to becoming a feared and misunderstood monster, exiled from society. But what do we know about this period in her life? How did Medusa cope with the loneliness, the fear, the shame? It's easy to imagine how she must have felt. Once admired, once celebrated, now she was left to live in the shadows of the world she once belonged to. No longer could she stroll through the streets of Athens or bask in the admiration of those around her. Instead, she was forced to retreat into the caves where no one could find her except, of course, the brave souls who came to challenge her. And this is where Medusa's curse begins to shift into something far more empowering. Medusa, despite her isolation, becomes an almost untouchable figure. She becomes a living legend, one that no mortal dares to approach. This kind of power, as twisted as it may seem, is a kind of protection. People were too afraid of her to do anything, which means she had an incredible degree of autonomy. No one could hurt her, and no one could challenge her. Of course, this power came at the cost of her humanity. She was no longer a part of the world she had once known, but a monster who lived alone in the dark. Yet, in her own way, she had reclaimed some control over her fate. And here's the interesting part: no one was quite sure what to make of Medusa. Some saw her as a tragic figure, a victim of the gods' cruelty, while others viewed her as a symbol of fear and power. Historians and mythographers still argue over whether Medusa should be seen as a victim or a villain. Was she a tragic heroine, cursed for her beauty? Or was she a villain, using her power to strike fear into the hearts of men? Some believe that Medusa's transformation from victim to monster was a form of empowerment, that in the face of her tragic fate, she found a way to survive. But here's where things take a sharp turn in the myth. After Medusa's isolation and transformation into the ultimate symbol of fear, she would eventually encounter one of Greek mythology's greatest heroes, Perseus. And it's through his actions that Medusa's story takes yet another unexpected twist. We'll get to that later. But before we do, let's take a moment to reflect on this strange turn of events. Medusa, once a beautiful woman, became a creature so powerful that no hero could face her without fear. But that fear, was it her ultimate undoing, or was it what gave her strength? So, here we are, contemplating Medusa's cursed her tragic fall from grace and her transformation into a feared monster. But we can't move forward without touching on something incredibly important: how the gods, and particularly Athena, reacted to her situation. The Greeks loved to meddle in the lives of mortals, but Athena's decision to curse Medusa wasn't as straightforward as it first seemed. After all, the curse on Medusa didn't just take away her beauty, it fundamentally changed the course of her life. Athena, a goddess known for wisdom and justice, took an extreme measure by punishing Medusa for the actions of Poseidon. But was it justice, or just another example of the capricious nature of the gods? After all, Medusa was a victim here. She didn't ask for Poseidon's attention, nor did she deserve the curse that Athena laid upon her. Athena, in a sense, blamed Medusa for something beyond her control. reinforcing the idea that women in these myths were often punished for being victims of male desire. The gods rarely made decisions that were truly fair or just. They often punished mortals for their weaknesses, their emotions, or their beauty. And in Medusa's case, it was her beauty that became both her strength and her downfall. But as you sit with this, there's something to consider. Athena's curse didn't just strip Medusa of her beauty, it gave her a new power, one that made her untouchable. Medusa, once a beautiful woman, could now turn anyone who looked at her into stone. Sure, it was terrifying, but it was also a kind of defense mechanism, something that protected her from the world she no longer belonged to. Imagine the power that comes with being able to freeze anyone in their tracks, to literally petrify them with just a glance. It's a power that isolates, but it also shields. This shield, however, comes at a cost. Medusa was no longer part of the world of humans or gods. She was something else entirely, something both feared and misunderstood. And for a while, she would remain this way, alone in her cave, away from the bustle of the world. But, like all things in Greek mythology, change is inevitable, and Medusa's life was about to take another sharp turn. Here comes Perseus, the hero. Now, you might think that with Medusa's terrifying curse, no one would dare challenge her. But as we know from many myths, heroes are often defined by their desire to prove themselves, to conquer the impossible. Perseus was no different. When King Polydectes tasked him with retrieving Medusa's head, Perseus accepted the challenge without fully understanding the danger that lay ahead. He would soon discover that slaying Medusa wasn't as simple as walking into her cave and lopping off her head. Perseus's journey was one fraught with obstacles, and the first of these was Medusa herself. No mortal could look at Medusa and live to tell the tale. So, how could Perseus defeat her? Well, that's where Athena and Hermes, two of the greatest gods in the Greek pantheon, came in. They didn't just send him on this mission with nothing but courage, they equipped him with divine tools. Athena gave him a shiny shield that would reflect Medusa's gaze without him having to look directly at her. Hermes provided him with winged sandals, allowing him to fly to the far-off location where Medusa lived, safely out of reach of her deadly gaze. In a way, Perseus's quest to slay Medusa was a divine test. Not only was he tasked with killing a creature that no one could look at without dying, but he also had to do so with the help of the gods, which only made him more vulnerable. He was just a mortal, after all, going up against a monster who had once been a beautiful woman. It was a battle between the divine and the mortal, a confrontation that would ultimately seal Medusa's fate. But here's where things get interesting. The idea of killing Medusa is often presented as a heroic act, something to be celebrated. Perseus is the hero, right? He's the one who slays the monster. But as we've seen, Medusa wasn't always a monster. She was a woman cursed by the gods, a victim of their whims. So, in a sense, Perseus's act of slaying Medusa is both heroic and tragic. He's not just killing a monster, he's ending the story of a woman who had been cursed beyond her control. And this brings up a fascinating discussion among scholars and mythologists. Is Perseus really the hero in this story? Or is he just another instrument of divine injustice? After all, he's sent to kill someone who never asked for her transformation into a monster. Was he really saving the world? Or was he simply fulfilling the gods' agenda? This is one of those questions that scholars still debate. Was Perseus truly the hero? Or was Medusa the tragic figure who had her story rewritten by the gods? Some see Medusa as a victim, and others see Perseus's slaying of her as just another form of punishment for a woman who never stood a chance. Either way, Medusa's fate was sealed, and her story would go on to live in legend for centuries. She was no longer just a woman. She became a symbol of divine punishment, a creature of terror, a figure whose head would later become a powerful weapon for Perseus. But what of her legacy? What does Medusa's story tell us about beauty, power, and punishment in the ancient world? We've seen how Medusa's fate was shaped by divine hand-show her beauty. Once her greatest asset was transformed into a curse that isolated her from the world. We've also explored how Perseus, the hero tasked with slaying her, is part of a larger divine narrative, one that raises questions about heroism, justice, and the power dynamics between gods and mortals. But now, let's take a step back and reflect on how Medusa's transformation, her journey from a beautiful woman to a terrifying monster, changed the way people in ancient Greece thought about monsters, power, and fate. In many Greek myths, monsters were often created by the gods as a form of punishment. We've already discussed how Medusa was punished for something that wasn't her fault, a common theme in ancient stories where mortals are punished for the actions of the gods. But here's where it gets a little tricky. Medusa's curse didn't just make her a monster, it gave her power. The ability to turn anyone into stone with a single glance is not a power most mortals or even gods would be comfortable with. And it's this power, born of punishment, that makes Medusa's story so compelling. While she was cursed to live in isolation, she also gained a kind of autonomy that no one else in her situation would have had. No one could harm her, no one could approach her, and no one dared to challenge her. In a twisted way, Medusa became untouchable, which was both a curse and a strange form of protection. Now, let's zoom out and take a look at how Medusa's story fits into the larger context of Greek mythology. In ancient Greece, gods and mortals didn't operate on the same level. Gods were omnipotent, controlling everything from the weather to the fate of entire cities. Mortals, on the other hand, were often at the mercy of these gods. The gods could grant blessings, but they could also impose terrible punishments. Medusa, though mortal, became a focal point for this divine power struggle. She was both a victim of the gods and a symbol of the gods' ability to shape the world as they saw fit. In this sense, Medusa is the embodiment of the gods' ability to elevate or destroy, to give and take power, with little concern for the consequences. But let's take a moment to explore something else. Medusa's myth was received by the people of ancient Greece. We know that mythology wasn't just entertainment. It was a reflection of the values, fears, and beliefs of a society. Medusa's story isn't just about a woman turning into a monster. It's also about the fear of power and beauty. In a society where power was often linked to physical appearance, Medusa's transformation speaks volumes about the dangers of beauty. For Medusa, beauty was both a gift and a curse. Her beauty attracted Poseidon, which led to her punishment. But it was her beauty that also made her a target for the god's wrath. In a way, Medusa's curse serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of being too beautiful or too powerful in a world ruled by gods. But, of course, there's another layer to this story. Medusa's myth also reflects the way women were viewed in ancient Greece. Women, in many Greek myths, were often portrayed as being at the mercy of the gods and men alike. Their beauty, sexuality, and behavior were often seen as things to be controlled or punished. Medusa's story, with its themes of victimization, punishment, and power, is a stark reminder of how women in ancient Greece were treated. Medusa didn't have control over her beauty, and she certainly didn't have control over the gods' decision to curse her. She was punished for something that was entirely out of her hands. And yet, the myth doesn't just paint her as a victim. It shows how she adapts to her curse and becomes a figure of power in her own right. Medusa's transformation from victim to monster is, in a strange way, empowering. She goes from being a woman controlled by the whims of the gods to a creature feared by all. But even with all this power, Medusa is still a tragic figure. She is cursed to live alone, away from the world she once belonged to, isolated in a cave, surrounded by the very people she can no longer touch. And here lies the true tragedy of Medusa's story. She becomes a monster because of what others did to her. But the very thing that makes her a monster also makes her a symbol of power and autonomy, albeit one born of pain and isolation. The scholars still debate whether Medusa's story is one of empowerment or victimization. Some argue that she's a tragic figure, doomed by the gods for no reason other than their own cruelty. Others see her as a figure of strength, someone who turned her curse into a weapon, refusing to be a victim. In either case, Medusa's myth endures as one of the most compelling and complex stories in Greek mythology. She is a victim, a monster, and a symbol of power, all rolled into one. And perhaps that is what makes her so unforgettable. She represents the fine line between victim and villain, between power and punishment, between beauty and monstrosity. But, as we know, every myth eventually meets its hero. And Medusa's hero, the one who will ultimately end her reign of terror, is on his way. Perseus, the brave young hero with his shiny shield and winged sandals, is about to embark on a journey to slay the monster once and for all. But before we get to that part of the story, it's important to recognize that Medusa's power, and the way it was wielded, was more than just a simple curse. It was a reflection of the world she lived, nay world, where gods and mortals, men and women, were all fighting for control in their own ways. So now we find ourselves at a crossroads in Medusa's myth, right at the moment where the hero Perseus enters the scene. He's young, brave, and perhaps a little too eager to prove himself. The task ahead of him? To slay Medusa and bring back her head, which, according to the myths, would possess immense power. But let's pause here for a moment. Perseus isn't just a random hero. No, he's been sent on this mission by King Polydectes. And while you might expect the hero to be the noble one in this tale, things aren't as straightforward as they seem. Perseus is just a pawn in a much bigger game, one that's being controlled by gods with their own agendas. Here's the funny thing about heroes in Greek mythology: they never seem to get the full picture, do they? Perseus, like so many heroes before him, thinks he's setting out to prove his worth, to accomplish a great feat. But the gods, in their infinite wisdom, or lack thereof, have given him divine gifts to make sure he succeeds. It's almost like Perseus is playing a game where the rules are rigged in his favor, divine help at every turn, and not much real danger, at least from a godly perspective. He's been equipped with winged sandals from Hermes and a reflective shield from Athena, two tools that will keep him from falling prey to Medusa's deadly gaze. So, it's not exactly a fair fight, is it? Now, before we get to the actual slaying of Medusa, let's take a step back and think about Perseus's mission. Medusa, the once beautiful woman cursed by the gods, is now a terrifying creature whose very gaze turns people into stone, and Perseus is going to kill her. But what's interesting is that this isn't just a simple monster-slaying story. It's not just about defeating an evil creature. It's about the gods using Medusa as a pawn in their endless games of power. Perseus isn't trying to save the world from Medusa's terror. He's on a quest to collect a trophy, and in doing so, he inadvertently becomes part of the larger narrative of divine control. Let's talk about the tools Perseus has been given: those winged sandals and that shiny shield. The sandals allow him to fly, and the shield lets him look at Medusa's reflection without gazing directly at her. This is key, because if Perseus were to look Medusa in the eyes, he would become just another victim, another stone statue in her collection. So, using the shield is a clever way around Medusa's curse. It's almost like a mirror, literally and figuratively. The hero needs to reflect her power back at her, but he must be careful not to engage directly. It's a tactical, clever move. But of course, there's a certain irony here, isn't there? Perseus, a mortal hero, needs divine intervention to defeat a woman who was cursed for something beyond her control. It's not exactly a fair fight. But let's return to Medusa for a second. As we've seen, she's more than just a monster. She's a victim of the gods' cruelty, someone who never asked for this curse, yet she became a symbol of divine punishment and power. And now, here comes Perseus, with the full backing of the gods, tasked with slaying her. But the gods haven't thought about what this really means. They haven't considered what Medusa's death represents. After all, she's not just a monster, she's a symbol of the consequences of divine power run amok. Her life and her death are a reflection of the Greek gods' ability to change the lives of mortals with little regard for the consequences. So, with that in mind, let's talk about what happens when Perseus finally confronts Medusa. Using his shield, he sneaks up on her while she sleeps. Medusa, the once beautiful woman turned monstrous creature, is vulnerable in her sleep, and Perseus seizes the opportunity. He strikes off her head, and it's a chilling momentum that marks the end of Medusa's tragic existence. But here's where it gets even more interesting. After Perseus decapitates Medusa, something remarkable happens. From her blood, which spills onto the ground, springs forth the mighty Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, the giant. So, in a sense, Medusa's death gives birth to new life, creating two new beings that will become important in other myths. It's a cruel irony, isn't it? Medusa, who had been punished for something beyond her control, now gives life to two creatures who will play their own roles in the grand tapestry of Greek mythology. In death, she becomes the origin of new mythological beings, but she herself is forever locked in the past. Her story, from beginning to end, is one of tragedy, punishment, and ultimately resurrection, though not for her, for the creatures born of her blood. Medusa is erased, but in a strange twist, she continues to live on through the legacy of what she gave birth to in her final moments. And here's the kicker: what does this say about the value of life in Greek mythology? Medusa, a cursed woman, becomes a monster, only to have her life snuffed out by a hero who is equipped with divine tools. But her death isn't the end of her story. Her legacy lives on in the creatures born from her blood. In a way, she becomes immortal not through her actions, but through the actions of others. Medusa's tale doesn't end with her death. It becomes a cornerstone of mythological history. Her head, even after its severing, will become a weapon for Perseus, one that he'll use to further his own adventures. So, what do we make of all this? Was Medusa just a pawn in the gods' eternal game, or was she something more? Was she a tragic figure whose story ended too soon, or was her death the final step in a cycle that she could never escape? This is the question that scholars and storytellers have debated for centuries. And no matter how you view it, one thing is certain: Medusa's story doesn't just end with her death. It lives on in the legacy she left behind. Now, with Medusa's head severed and the monster's reign of terror officially over, we might think that the story is finally reaching its peaceful conclusion. But Greek myths are never so tidy, are they? Instead of fading into the background, Medusa's legacy only deepens, and in many ways, she becomes more powerful in death than she ever was alive. Perseus, with the head of Medusa in tow, becomes an even more celebrated hero. The head, still capable of turning anyone into stone, is used as a weapon and a symbol of power. But Medusa's head doesn't just serve as a weapon. It becomes a symbol of both her curse and her unintended empowerment. But here's where things get strange. Medusa's head, now decapitated and safely contained in a bag, still holds immense power. Perseus carries it with him, using it to strike fear into his enemies and solidify his own heroic status. But in some versions of the myth, Perseus later gives the head to Athena, who places it on her shield, the Aegis. This is where Medusa's legacy begins to intertwine with Athena's own symbol of power. Athena, the goddess who cursed Medusa in the first place, now adopts her image as part of her own armament. It's a bizarre twist of fate, isn't it? Medusa, who was once punished for her beauty and power, now becomes an integral part of Athena's own power, a power that the gods now use to protect themselves. So, what does this tell us about Medusa? Was she ever really a villain? Or was she, as some have suggested, just a victim of divine cruelty, turned into a symbol of terror because of the gods' whims? The answer is more complicated than just labeling her as a victim or villain. In many ways, Medusa's story embodies the complex and often contradictory nature of power and punishment in Greek mythology. She starts as a beautiful woman cursed by the gods, becomes a monster, and then, in a strange twist, her head is used as a symbol of protection and power by the very gods who condemned her. In death, Medusa transcends her curse, becoming not just a tragic figure, but a living symbol of power that outlasts her own life. Let's zoom out for a moment and reflect on the significance of this. In many cultures, the idea of a monster's head or image being used as a protective symbol is common. We see it in the use of Medusa's head on Athena's shield, and later in Roman and medieval traditions, where symbols of fear were used to ward off evil. Medusa's head, with its ability to turn enemies into stone, serves as a reminder of the dangers of defying the gods, but also as a warning to anyone who dares challenge the gods. By placing it on her shield, Athena transforms Medusa's terrifying power into a tool for her own protection. But the deeper question remains, why did Medusa's head, once the source of her torment, become something so revered? After all, she was a woman who was punished for something she couldn't control, and yet her death did not end her influence. If anything, it solidified her place in Greek mythology forever. She became more than just a monster. She became a symbol of transformation and redemption. In a way, Medusa's death was not the end of her story, but the beginning of her legacy. The myth of Medusa also touches on a recurring theme in Greek mythology, the idea of transformation. Throughout these stories, we see characters who change, often because of divine intervention. But Medusa's transformation is particularly powerful because it involves a shift not just in form, but in power. She goes from being a victim to becoming a creature of immense power, capable of turning anyone who looks at her into stone. And while that transformation comes at a great cost, it also allows her to become something more than just a mortal woman. She becomes an enduring symbol of fear, strength, and vengeance. However, despite this power, Medusa's death is still tragic. She is ultimately a victim of the gods' cruelty, a figure who never asked for the fate she was given. Her beauty, once her greatest asset, became her downfall, and the gods' interference in her life led to her ultimate destruction. But even in death, Medusa defies the gods' control over her. She doesn't simply fade away. She becomes a part of the very fabric of Greek mythology, a character whose legacy continues to influence the gods and heroes alike. In the end, what do we make of Medusa's story? Is she a tragic victim, a monster, or a symbol of divine punishment turned to power? The answer depends on how we choose to view her. Medusa's story is a complex one, filled with contradictions and ironies. She is both a victim and a villain, both powerless and powerful, both cursed and empowered. And that's what makes her such a fascinating figure in Greek mythology. She is not easily categorized. She is a reminder of how the gods could change the lives of mortals with a single act of cruelty, but also a testament to the resilience and power that can come from transformation, even when that transformation comes with great cost. And while we may never have a definitive answer to the question of whether Medusa was a hero or a victim, one thing is clear: her legacy lives on. She may have started as a beautiful woman, punished and cursed by the gods, but in the end, she became a symbol of power, of transformation, and of the complex relationship between mortals and the divine. We've been following Medusa's story through her transformation, her curse, and her ultimate death. But now, let's shift gears and take a deeper look at what her myth tells us about the role of women in Greek mythology. If you think about it, Medusa's transformation wasn't just about divine power. It was also a commentary on beauty, strength, and the way women were perceived and treated in ancient Greece. Medusa's story is as much about the gods' whims as it is about the way society viewed women, particularly those who dared to be more than what the gods or men expected them to be. Let's start with beauty. In many myths, beauty is depicted as a virtue, something to be admired, something that elevates the individual. And while it might sound like the perfect gift, it's also often presented as a dangerous one, especially for women. Medusa's beauty, as we've seen, is what first attracts Poseidon. But it's also the very thing that leads to her downfall. Poseidon's lust for her is punished, but instead of punishing him, Athena curses Medusa. The beauty that once made Medusa special is turned into her greatest curse. It's a disturbing twist in the myth, because it implies that beauty, especially in women, can be both a blessing and a curse, something that both elevates and isolates. In ancient Greece, women's beauty wasn't just a reflection of their physical traits, it was often tied to their worth and their role in society. Medusa's story reinforces the idea that women's lives were often defined by their beauty, and when that beauty was no longer desirable or useful, they were discarded, or worse, punished. Medusa's curse isn't just about turning her into a monster, it's about the way society, through the gods, punished her for something she couldn't control. And her transformation into a creature feared by all is a reflection of how women, even in myth, could be pushed to the margins, away from the world of men and gods alike. But Medusa's story is not just one of victimhood. As she is transformed into a monster, she gains a new kind of power, the power to turn anyone to stone with just a glance. In some ways, this gives her a form of autonomy that she never had as a mortal woman. She is now in control of who she interacts with and how she is perceived. No one dares approach her. No one dares challenge her. And in a way, Medusa becomes the embodiment of a power that allows her to defend herself, even if it comes at the cost of isolation. Yet, this power comes at an incredibly steep price. Medusa is alone, trapped in a cave, surrounded by people she can't touch, and unable to live the life she once had. The irony of her situation is almost unbearable. She's been given the power to protect herself, but she's also been separated from the world she once belonged to. Her power keeps others at bay, but it also ensures that she can never be part of the world again. And this is where Medusa's curse speaks to the deeper truths about isolation, strength, and the cost of power. But as we've seen in the previous chapters, Medusa's story doesn't end with her death. After she is slain by Perseus, her head becomes a powerful weapon that even the gods find useful. Athena, who cursed her in the first place, ends up using Medusa's image on her shield, the Aegis, turning the very power that once cursed Medusa into a symbol of protection. This is another interesting aspect of Medusa's legacy. In death, she becomes a tool of divine power, a symbol of both fear and strength that the gods wield for their own purposes. Medusa's transformation from a beautiful woman to a monster, and then into a symbol of divine power, is a reflection of how the gods saw societies and discarded her as they saw fit. This twist in the story also raises questions about the value of life in Greek mythology. Medusa's death isn't just the end of her personal story. It's the beginning of her transformation into a tool for the gods. Her head, still capable of turning people to stone, becomes something more than just a weapon. It becomes a symbol of divine power and protection. In a strange way, Medusa's death is her most powerful moment, as it marks the point where her curse becomes a gift to the gods. It's also worth noting that Medusa's legacy doesn't stop there. Over time, her image became a popular motif in art and literature. The image of the Gorgon, with its snake-filled hair and petrifying gaze, became a symbol of both power and danger. Medusa's head was used as a protective emblem in various cultures, including in Roman and medieval traditions, as a way to ward off evil. In this way, Medusa, the cursed woman who once embodied punishment, became a symbol of strength and resilience that would be revered and feared for centuries to come. Medusa's story, in the end, is not just one of tragedy or empowerment. It's a reflection of the complex relationship between beauty, power, and punishment in the ancient world. She is a figure who starts as a victim of divine cruelty, but through her transformation, she gains a new kind of power, one that allows her to take control of her own fate, even if it isolates her from the rest of the world. And in her death, she becomes something more than just a victim. She becomes a symbol of the ways in which power is used, both by mortals and gods, and the cost of that power. So, as we reach the end of this journey through Medusa's myth, what can we take away from her story? Perhaps it's a reminder of how power can change, how it can be wielded and misused, and how the legacy of a single individual can transcend time. Medusa's story is tragic, yes, but it is also empowering. She is a woman who was punished for something beyond her control, but through that punishment, she gained the power to shape her own fate and, in doing so, became one of the most enduring figures in Greek mythology. As we reflect on Medusa's legacy, it's hard not to notice the layers of contradiction woven into her story. She starts off as a victim cursed by the gods for something she never asked for. And yet, through her tragic transformation into a monster, she gains a form of autonomy and power that she never had as a mortal. But as we know from Greek mythology, even in the most empowering moments, there's often a tragic cost. Medusa's power to petrify was, in a sense, a defense mechanism, but it came at the price of isolation. She was untouchable, sure, but she was also alone, trapped in a cave away from the world she once belonged to. What's truly fascinating about Medusa's myth is the way it contrasts beauty and power. We've talked about how Medusa's beauty was both her blessing and her curse. But beauty, in the context of Greek mythology, is rarely a neutral thing. In a world where gods and mortals collide, beauty often becomes a form of power. Medusa's beauty caught the attention of Poseidon, and while that moment was supposed to be a romantic encounter, it turned into the catalyst for her undoing. And Athena, the goddess of wisdom, chose to punish her, taking away her beauty and transforming her into a monster. In that transformation, Medusa's beauty was no longer something that could be adored, but something that could be feared. But the transformation wasn't just a loss of beauty. It was a shift in how Medusa's power functioned. While she lost the ability to be admired, she gained the ability to petrify anyone who looked at her. This power one that turned her from a beautiful woman to a feared monster was an ironic gift. She was no longer at the mercy of others' gazes. She could control who looked at her and who lived to tell the tale. But in some ways, this power wasn't a true form of freedom. Yes, she could defend herself, but she was also shut off from the world. She couldn't interact with anyone, not without turning them to stone. It's the ultimate form of control and the ultimate form of isolation. Let's take a moment to appreciate the irony of Medusa's existence. She starts out as a woman whose beauty is her most powerful asset. But when that beauty becomes a curse, she transforms into something else entirely. She's no longer just a woman to be admired or desired. She becomes a terrifying symbol of divine punishment. Her power to turn people to stone might have been born from the gods' cruelty, but it also gave her a level of control she could never have had as a mortal woman. In her monstrous form, Medusa became a figure to be feared, but also one to be respected. No mortal, no god, could challenge her without facing the consequences of their own actions. And in this strange twist, she becomes a symbol of empowerment, even in the face of her tragic fate. But here's the thing. Medusa's story doesn't just serve as a warning about beauty or power, it's a cautionary tale about the consequences of divine intervention in the lives of mortals. Medusa was punished for being the object of Poseidon's desire, but she was also punished by Athena for something that was beyond her control. Her fate was sealed by the gods, and the gods alone decided her path. And what's more, the gods didn't just punish Medusa, they used her as a symbol of their own power. Athena, the goddess who cursed her, eventually took Medusa's head as a weapon, putting it on her shield as a symbol of protection. It's a strange turn of events, isn't it? The very curse that punished Medusa became a source of power for the gods, who used her image as a tool to ward off evil. But Medusa's head, still capable of turning anyone who looked at it into stone, wasn't just a weapon for the gods, it was a reminder of how the gods used mortals to serve their own purposes. Medusa's death, in a way, symbolized the gods' control over life and death, and their ability to manipulate mortals to further their own agendas. Perseus, the hero who killed Medusa, was merely the instrument through which the gods' will was carried out. He wasn't just slaying a monster. He was fulfilling a divine task cone that would ultimately serve the interests of the gods, not Medusa. In this sense, Medusa's story becomes a powerful metaphor for the way gods controlled the fates of mortals. She was no longer a victim in the traditional sense. She had been transformed into a figure of power, whose influence could not be ignored. And in death, Medusa's head became a weapon that represented not just her own power, but the gods' ability to control and shape the world. The gods could destroy her, but they could not erase her. She became more than a myth. She became a symbol of the ways in which power and punishment could be used to shape the lives of mortals. But there's one more twist to this story, one that isn't often discussed. Medusa's death, as tragic and cruel as it was, also paved the way for the birth of new life. From the blood that spilled from her severed neck came two new beings, Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a giant. In a way, Medusa's death wasn't just an end, it was a beginning. She gave life to these new creatures, who would go on to play important roles in other myths. Medusa's blood gave birth to new life, even as she was taken away. It's an ironic and bittersweet end to her story. She gave everything she had, even in death, to create something new. Medusa's legacy, therefore, isn't just about fear, power, or divine punishment. It's also about the idea of transformation, how something terrible can lead to something new. Medusa's story, in the end, is about the intersection of fate, power, and the consequences of the gods' interference in the lives of mortals. And through it all, Medusa remains one of the most enduring and complex figures in Greek mythology. As we continue on this journey through Medusa's myth, it's impossible not to reflect on the impact she has had on culture, art, and literature throughout the centuries. Her story, tragic as it is, has endured and evolved, transcending its ancient Greek origins to become a symbol of both fear and fascination. While many ancient myths were eventually forgotten or reinterpreted, Medusa's tale continues to resonate, especially in modern times. Her transformation from victim to monster, from beauty to power, has sparked endless debate and artistic expression. But let's step back and ask, what makes Medusa's story so compelling, even today? It's her complexity. Medusa is not a simple villain or a straightforward victim. She's both. She starts as a woman wronged by the gods, punished for something she had no control over, and yet she also transforms into a creature of immense power, one that strikes fear into even the gods themselves. In this sense, she's both a tragic figure and an empowering one. Her curse gives her power, but at a great personal cost. She becomes a monster, but in doing so, she also reclaims a sense of autonomy that she never had as a mortal. And there's another layer to Medusa's story that's often overlooked. Her power is not only about turning people to stone, it's about the control she has over her own fate. Sure, she's isolated, living in a cave, but that isolation also shields her. No one can touch her, and no one can hurt her. This power to protect herself from the world, even if it means living alone, is a fascinating aspect of Medusa's character. She's been punished, yes, but she's also been given the ultimate defense that forces others to fear her. Medusa's isolation, however, is a double-edged sword. While it protects her, it also keeps her from ever truly interacting with anyone again. She's trapped in her own curse, unable to engage with the world she once knew. And yet, she remains an incredibly powerful figure, despite her isolation. Perhaps this is the greatest irony of Medusa's story. She was cursed for her beauty, but that beauty ultimately led to her transformation into a creature that could control her own fate. She was condemned by the gods, but in the end, she was the one who wielded the power. Let's not forget the role of Perseus in all of this. While Medusa's myth is undoubtedly one of the most memorable in Greek mythology, Perseus, the hero who kills her, often takes center stage. However, the truth is that Perseus wouldn't have succeeded without the help of the gods. Athena and Hermes equipped him with divine tools that allowed him to approach Medusa without being turned to stone. So, while Perseus gets credit for slaying the monster, it's clear that he didn't do it alone. And that raises an interesting question. Did Perseus truly deserve all the glory for this act? Or was he just a pawn in the gods' game, a mortal sent to fulfill a task assigned to him by the divine? As we've seen, Medusa's story is filled with contradictions. She's both a victim and a villain. She's punished for something she didn't do, but she also gains a kind of strength from her curse. She's isolated and alone, but in her isolation, she finds power. The complexity of her character has made her an enduring figure, one that has been reimagined and reinterpreted countless times in literature, art, and culture. In some ways, Medusa represents the intersection of power and victimhood, of beauty and monstrosity. She embodies the tragic consequences of divine intervention, but she also represents the way that power, even when it's born from punishment, can be used to reshape one's fate. But Medusa's myth doesn't just end with her death. As we know, her head becomes a powerful weapon, used by Perseus, and eventually gifted to Athena. The legacy of Medusa continues to shape the world, long after her death, and her image has been used in art and literature for centuries. Her likeness can be found in countless pieces of art, from ancient Greek pottery to Renaissance paintings, and she continues to be a powerful symbol of both fear and empowerment. In fact, some interpretations of Medusa focus not on her curse, but on the way her image has been appropriated by artists and storytellers throughout history. In many ways, Medusa has become a symbol of resistance and defiance. In modern interpretations, she's often seen as a feminist icon, a woman who was punished for her beauty and power, but ultimately transformed that punishment into strength. She's a figure who has been wronged by the gods, but she doesn't simply accept her fate. Instead, she uses her curse as a weapon, turning her power to her advantage. And in doing so, she challenges the very forces that sought to control her. In today's world, Medusa's story resonates with many people, particularly those who have been marginalized or oppressed. Her transformation from victim to monster, from beautiful woman to feared creature, speaks to the ways in which power and beauty are often used to control and silence those who are seen as different. But Medusa's legacy also shows that even in the face of such control, there's always the potential for transformation, for reclaiming power, and for finding strength in the face of adversity. In the end, Medusa's myth is not just a tale of monsters and heroes, it's a story about power, punishment, and transformation. It's about how beauty can be both a gift and a curse, how power can be used for both good and evil, and how the gods, in their infinite wisdom, or lack thereof, can shape the lives of mortals in ways that are both cruel and empowering. Medusa's story is one of resilience, of turning a curse into strength, and of refusing to be forgotten. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful thing about her legacy. It's a story that will never be fully told, one that will continue to evolve and inspire for generations to come. By now, we've explored the many facets of Medusa's myth or tragic curse, her tragic isolation, her eventual transformation from victim to symbol of power. We've seen how Medusa's power was something born out of punishment, how her beauty, once her greatest gift, became a source of terror and a weapon of her own making. And while Perseus's role in the myth cannot be ignored, it's important to reflect on the deeper layers of Medusa's legacy and what she represents in the larger context of mythology and history. Medusa's story raises questions about the way we view beauty, power, and justice. In many ways, Medusa is a reflection of the ancient world's obsession with both the appearance and power of women. As we've discussed, beauty in Greek mythology is often both a blessing and a curse, and Medusa's story underscores the peril of being too beautiful, too powerful, or simply too visible. She is punished for being the object of Poseidon's desire, yet it is her curse that ultimately gives her power. In this sense, Medusa becomes a paradox. She is a victim of the gods' whims, but she also becomes a figure of strength, fear, and defiance. In many respects, Medusa's transformation challenges traditional views of women in mythology. She is often depicted as a victim, punished for something she couldn't control, but her story doesn't stop there. She doesn't simply succumb to her fate, she adapts and becomes something much more powerful than anyone could have expected. Her ability to turn people to stone symbolizes not only a form of protection but also a means of reclaiming her autonomy. This shift in power, where Medusa takes control of her own fate and becomes a symbol of fear, allows her to transcend the victim narrative that many other women in Greek mythology are confined to. And yet, even in this empowerment, Medusa's story doesn't provide a simple solution. She doesn't get the happy ending we might hope for. Yes, she gains power, but at the expense of her humanity. The curse makes her powerful, but it also ensures that she will never again experience love, companionship, or normal human interaction. Her tragic isolation becomes one of the defining elements of her myth. Medusa becomes a symbol of how power can both protect and isolate, how beauty can be both a gift and a curse, and how the consequences of divine intervention can linger long after the gods have moved on to other matters. But beyond Medusa's personal story, her myth also serves as a commentary on the role of women in the ancient world. Throughout Greek mythology, women are often depicted as being at the mercy of the gods and men. Their beauty, sexuality, and even their actions are frequently the subject of punishment and control. Medusa's transformation into a monster, while tragic, offers a new lens through which we can understand the way women were viewed and treated by society. She starts as a beautiful, admired woman, but is punished for being desirable, for being the object of attention. This dynamic echoes the way many women were treated throughout history, punished or ostracized for their beauty or their perceived power, and often reduced to being symbols of fear rather than individuals with agency. This, in turn, brings us to the ongoing relevance of Medusa's myth in modern times. Her story has been interpreted and reinterpreted countless times in art, literature, and popular culture, often taking on new meanings as societal attitudes evolve. Today, Medusa is sometimes seen as a feminist icon, a symbol of a woman who was punished for her beauty, but who, in the end, transformed that punishment into strength. She is a figure who defies the gods and the expectations placed upon her, reclaiming her narrative even as she remains isolated. The transformation from victim to empowered figure in Medusa's story has resonated with many who see her as a metaphor for personal strength, resilience, and defiance. Modern portrayals of Medusa often emphasize her power, her autonomy, and her ability to shape her own fate. She is no longer just a monster, she is a figure who has taken control of her destiny, even in the face of a curse that seeks to destroy her. This transformation has led to new interpretations of her character, one where Medusa is seen not as a tragic figure, but as a woman who has transcended the limitations imposed upon her by the gods and by society. She is a figure of strength, someone who has reclaimed her power despite the challenges she faced. At the same time, Medusa's story also highlights the dangers of unchecked power. Though she is empowered by her curse, it's also what makes her isolated and alone. The gods may have given her a weapon, but they also ensured that she would be unable to live freely. And this raises an interesting question. Is power worth it if it comes with such profound consequences? Medusa, in many ways, becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of both absolute power and the consequences of divine intervention. Her myth is one of the most enduring in Western culture because it speaks to something universal: the struggle between fate and free will, beauty and monstrosity, victimhood and empowerment. Medusa's curse may have isolated her, but it also gave her the strength to defend herself, to survive in a world that rejected her. Her death at the hands of Perseus, while marking the end of her physical existence, only solidified her place in mythology and popular culture. Her legacy, in the form of her head, would live on, becoming a symbol of both divine power and human strength. But perhaps the greatest lesson of Medusa's story is that her power was not simply a result of her crusade, was also a reflection of how she responded to that curse. She may have been punished by the gods, but in the end, she found a way to control her own fate. Medusa's story, then, is not just a tale of victimhood, it is a story of resilience, transformation, and the ultimate reclamation of power. Now that we've explored Medusa's power, her isolation, and her transformation into a symbol of strength, let's reflect on the larger cultural impact of her myth. Medusa is, without a doubt, one of the most compelling figures in Greek mythology, but her story doesn't just end with her becoming a symbol of divine punishment or power. Her influence extends far beyond ancient Greece, continuing to shape modern interpretations of mythology, feminism, and even how we understand the relationship between beauty and strength. In the centuries following the myth of Medusa, her image has been reinterpreted in countless ways. Artists, writers, and scholars have found new layers of meaning in her story, and Medusa's role in art and culture has shifted dramatically. Originally, she was seen as a cautionary figure, someone whose beauty and strength were punished by the gods, a tragic victim of fate. But as time has passed, Medusa has been reimagined. She's no longer just a monster to be feared. Instead, she has become a symbol of defiance, a figure who turned her curse into an empowering force. One of the most striking ways Medusa has been reinterpreted is in the context of feminist thought. Many modern readers and scholars have reclaimed Medusa as a feminist iconon who was punished for her beauty and her power, but who ultimately takes control of her own destiny. In a society where women were often depicted as passive and powerless, Medusa's story is a stark contrast. She is a woman who refuses to accept the role that has been forced upon her. Yes, she is cursed, but she uses that curse to her advantage, becoming a figure of power and strength, rather than remaining a victim of the gods' cruelty. This reinterpretation of Medusa speaks to a broader cultural shift in the way we view power, beauty, and autonomy, especially for women. In many ways, Medusa's myth encapsulates the struggle for agency in a world that often limits the power of women. She was punished for something she could not control her beauty yet. She found a way to turn that punishment into her strength. This transformation has resonated deeply in contemporary discussions of feminism, as Medusa's myth now represents the power that women can reclaim, even in the face of tremendous adversity. And let's not forget how Medusa's image has been used in visual art over the centuries. From ancient pottery to Renaissance paintings to modern film and literature, Medusa has been a subject of artistic fascination. In many of these works, Medusa is not just depicted as a monster to be slain, but as a powerful, sometimes tragic figure. Artists have explored her beauty, her transformation, and her complex relationship with power. Medusa's head, in particular, has become an iconic symbol, often used to represent strength, fear, and the consequences of divine retribution. Take, for example, Caravaggio's famous painting Medusa, where the Gorgon's severed head is portrayed with unsettling realism and emotion. This painting doesn't just show Medusa as a monster, it invites the viewer to reflect on her pain, her power, and her transformation. The raw emotion in the painting allows us to see Medusa not just as a mythical creature, but as a figure who embodies the complexities of suffering and power. In many ways, this artistic portrayal challenges the traditional narrative of Medusa as a mere villain, inviting us to consider her humanity even in her monstrous form. Beyond art, Medusa's legacy continues to influence modern pop culture, from movies and television shows to books and video games. She appears as a symbol of both danger and empowerment, embodying the tension between victimhood and strength. In films like Clash of the Titans and Percy Jackson, The Olympians, Medusa is presented as a monster to be defeated, but her portrayal also allows for moments of sympathy and reflection. The way these modern works present Medusa speaks to our ongoing fascination with the complex nature of her myth. She is both feared and revered, and her power remains, even in her death. It's interesting to note that Medusa's influence isn't limited to Western interpretations. The myth of Medusa has crossed cultural boundaries, influencing art and literature in a variety of traditions. In some Eastern cultures, for example, Medusa's image has been adopted as a symbol of protection, just as it was in ancient Greece, where her image was often placed on shields or other objects to ward off evil. The idea that Medusa's power could be used to protect rather than harm is a fascinating inversion of the original myth. It highlights how the symbolism of Medusa can shift depending on the cultural context, and how her legacy is shaped by the way we understand power, beauty, and fear. But despite her many interpretations, one thing is certain. Medusa's myth endures because of her complexity. She is not a simple villain, nor is she a pure victim. She is a woman transformed by divine cruelty, but through that transformation, she gains power. Her curse is not just a punishment, it is also a source of strength. She is both a victim of the gods' whims and a powerful figure who defies them. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring element of her story, her ability to transcend the role of victim and embrace her own power, even in the face of insurmountable odds. Medusa's myth asks us to consider what it means to be punished, to be transformed, and to find power in the most unlikely of places. It challenges us to think about beauty and strength, and how society shapes both. It reminds us that the gods may control our fate, but we still have the ability to shape our own story, to reclaim our power, and to define who we are. Medusa's legacy, ultimately, is one of transformation, empowerment, and defiance. It is a reminder that, even in the most crushing circumstances, there is always the potential for something new to emerge, something stronger, something more resilient. As we continue to unravel Medusa's myth, it's impossible not to notice how her story mirrors the complexities of human nature, both its beauty and its darker sides. Medusa's transformation into a Gorgon wasn't just a physical change. It was a profound shift in her very essence. From a beautiful mortal to a monster, she underwent a metamorphosis that symbolized how power, beauty, and victimhood could intertwine in ways that transcend simple categories of good and evil. This myth resonates because it speaks to the ways in which people often experience drastic shifts in their lives, ones that force them to confront not only external realities but also their own inner worlds. Let's pause and take a closer look at how Medusa's story can be seen as an allegory for the journey of self-transformation, particularly when faced with trauma. Her change was the result of an attack first from Poseidon, then from Athena, who imposed a punishment that transformed her into a figure of terror. But once she had been cursed, Medusa's choices became constrained by the world around her. This shift from victim to monster, while tragic, also reflects how individuals often respond to trauma. Like Medusa, many people who face unimaginable hardship find themselves transformed by their circumstances, often into something unrecognizable, both to themselves and to the world. This sense of transformation is important because, in Medusa's case, she didn't choose to become the monster. She was made one by forces beyond her control. But, as we've discussed, she ultimately found a form of agency in her curse. She learned how to use her monstrous power to protect herself and gain control over her own fate, even if that control came at the cost of her humanity. This resonates with many people who, after experiencing great trauma, find ways to adapt and survive. Medusa's story shows us that, sometimes, survival means becoming something you never intended to be. However, Medusa's transformation is not just about survival. Her story also invites us to think about the consequences of that survival. By turning others to stone, Medusa isolates herself from the very world she was once part of. Her power to protect herself becomes her curse, for it forces her into an eternal solitude. And this too mirrors how people often struggle with the consequences of their own survival. In the wake of trauma, many people find themselves disconnected from others, unable to engage with the world in the way they once did. In Medusa's case, her power and her isolation becomes a metaphor for how trauma can strip someone of their ability to connect, to love, or even to interact with others without fear of rejection or harm. The curse of isolation is one of the most poignant aspects of Medusa's myth. Despite the power she gains from her curse, Medusa is condemned to live in exile, away from society and loved ones. This is the ultimate irony of her story. Her very power, which could have been a tool for empowerment, becomes the thing that keeps her alone. It's a reflection of how people who are forced to adapt to harsh circumstances sometimes find themselves disconnected from others. What starts as a mechanism of protection can end up being a tool of self-imposed exile. Yet, in Medusa's myth, this isolation is not without its benefits. Medusa's solitude allows her to reflect, to process her transformation, and to come to terms with the power she holds. She becomes a figure who embodies both fear and self-sufficiency. Her isolation is not simply punishment, it is also the space in which she learns to control her new abilities and harness them. Medusa's isolation, then, serves as a powerful reminder of how self-reflection and time alone can be both a curse and a tool for personal growth. Her curse allows her to become the very thing she never wanted to be, but in doing so, she finds a form of power that no one else can claim. This duality of Medusa's story, her power, and her isolation, highlights an important aspect of human experience: the way in which we navigate the tension between external expectations and internal transformation. Medusa's external transformation, from a beautiful woman to a feared monster, parallels the internal transformations many people undergo when they face trauma or hardship. In Medusa's case, the transformation was forced upon her, but for many people, transformation comes from within sometimes, in response to external circumstances, sometimes as a means of adapting to the world. Medusa's journey from beauty to beast isn't just a literal transformation, it's a metaphorical one as well. It shows how a person's external identity, particularly their beauty or physical appearance, can be forever altered by their experiences. Medusa's beauty was the source of her downfall, but her transformation into a monster was also a way of reclaiming control over her fate. She was no longer the passive victim of the gods' whims. Instead, she became the active agent in her own story, using her new form to protect herself and to carve out a space in the world for herself, albeit one that was solitary and distant from others. This theme of internal transformation is one of the most compelling aspects of Medusa's myth. She is not simply the victim of divine cruelty. She is a woman who, through her trials, becomes something entirely new. And in doing so, she shows us how powerful transformation can be, even when it's born from trauma. Medusa's power is not just the ability to turn people to stone it, is her ability to survive, to adapt, and to find strength in the most unlikely of places. As we continue to unravel her myth, we see how Medusa's legacy goes far beyond the ancient world. She has become a symbol not just of fear, but of transformation and resilience. Her story continues to inspire countless people who see in her a figure who has survived the worst of what life and the gods could throw at her. Medusa's myth serves as a reminder that, even in our darkest moments, we have the potential to transform ourselves, to take control of our fate, and to find strength in the most difficult circumstances. And so, as we come to the final chapters of Medusa's journey, it's clear that her story is one that transcends time. She is no longer just a figure of Greek mythology. She is a symbol of transformation, of empowerment, and of survival. In her myth, we find echoes of the struggles faced by countless individuals who have had to navigate the complex journey from victimhood to strength. Medusa's story, at its core, is about finding power in the face of adversity and using that power to reshape our own lives. As we approach the final moments of Medusa's myth, it's important to reflect on her lasting legacy. By now, you've witnessed her transformation from a beautiful woman to a fearsome monster, and from a victim of divine cruelty to a symbol of both strength and isolation. But Medusa's story doesn't just stop at the moment of her death, or even her posthumous existence as a weapon used by Perseus and Athena. Her myth continues to reverberate through history, evolving with each retelling and each reinterpretation. What makes Medusa so enduring, so captivating, is the duality that she embodies. On one hand, she's the archetypal victim, a woman punished for circumstances beyond her control. Her beauty, once celebrated, becomes the very thing that leads to her downfall. She's cursed by Athena, whose divine wrath transforms her into a grotesque monster, feared by everyone she once knew. But on the other hand, Medusa's transformation into a Gorgon is also a form of empowerment. Through her curse, she gains the power to protect herself, to make others fear her, and in some ways, to take control over her own fate. She is a paradoxical victim who becomes a powerful figure in her own right. Medusa's ability to turn people into stone is one of the most enduring symbols of this power. It's not just a weapon, it's a metaphor for the ways in which trauma, pain, and suffering can transform someone into a figure who is both feared and revered. Medusa was no longer a passive participant in her fate. She became active, using the very curse that was meant to punish her as a means of survival. The stone that others turned into wasn't just a consequence of their actions, it was a reflection of the power Medusa had over her own existence. She became a force to be reckoned with, not because she sought revenge, but because she had learned to survive by wielding the power that had been forced upon her. This paradox, Medusa as both victim and monster, speaks to the human condition in a way that's still relevant today. We've all faced moments of extreme hardship, times when we felt powerless, or when we felt that the world was against us. Medusa's myth reminds us that even in those moments of victimhood, there is the potential for transformation. In Medusa's case, her transformation was forced upon her, but the underlying message of her myth is clear. Even in the face of the greatest adversity, we have the potential to find strength and power. Medusa's journey is about reclaiming that power, even when it's born from the most painful circumstances. And this theme of transformation and empowerment is what makes Medusa such an enduring figure in modern culture. Over time, her story has been reclaimed by many as a symbol of resilience, of defiance, against a world that seeks to control or destroy us. As we discussed earlier, Medusa has become a feminist icon for many, someone who was punished for her beauty, but who ultimately turned that punishment into a source of strength. The idea that she can be both a victim and a powerful figure is what resonates with people today, especially in a world where power dynamics, gender roles, and expectations of women are constantly being challenged. But Medusa's legacy is not limited to the feminist movement. Her myth has also been reimagined in ways that explore themes of isolation, survival, and self-empowerment. Artists, writers, and thinkers have taken her story and used it to reflect on the ways we navigate the complexities of being human. Medusa's isolation, her forced separation from the world she once knew, mirrors the loneliness that many people experience when they are cast aside by society, whether because of their beauty, their differences, or their inability to conform to societal expectations. Her journey is a reminder that isolation doesn't have to be the end of one's story. It can be the beginning of transformation, as it was for her. Think about it. Even in her isolation, Medusa finds a form of empowerment that allows her to stand apart from the world. Yes, she's a monster, but in a strange way, she becomes more powerful than any mortal or god. Her power lies in her ability to protect herself, to defend against a world that sought to hurt her. And perhaps that's the most empowering part of Medusa's myth, her ability to reclaim her agency, even when everything around her is out of her control. And then there's the ultimate irony. Medusa's death, which is often seen as the end of her story, is actually the beginning of her immortality. After Perseus slays her, her head becomes a tool of power, an object of divine protection used by Athena. Medusa, the victim of divine cruelty, is now a symbol of divine protection and strength. Her head is no longer a symbol of punishment, but of power, a power that transcends her death and lives on through the gods and their weapons. It's a reminder that, even in death, Medusa remains a force to be reckoned with. As we come to the final chapters of Medusa's myth, it's clear that her story is one of transformation, not just from beauty to monster, but from victim to symbol of strength. She is a figure who has transcended her curse, who has transformed her pain into power, and whose legacy continues to inspire and challenge the world long after her death. Medusa's myth is not just about the gods or the heroes, it's about the human capacity for resilience, transformation, and empowerment. It's about finding strength in the face of adversity, and embracing the power that lies within, even when it seems impossible to see. Her myth is a testament to the enduring nature of stories that challenge us to rethink our definitions of power, victimhood, and strength. Medusa may have been punished by the gods, but in the end, she became a symbol of something much more enduring: the power to survive, to transform, and to find strength in even the most difficult of circumstances. In that sense, her story will continue to echo through history, inspiring generations to come. Now that we've explored Medusa's tragic, transformative journey from victimhood to empowerment, her myth doesn't really come to an end with her death. In fact, Medusa's legacy is not just about the myths and stories surrounding her, but also about the lessons we can draw from her transformation. Her story speaks not only to the ancient world, but resonates deeply in our modern era as well. In the end, what Medusa represents is the potential for self-transformation and strength even in the most impossible of circumstances. Let's reflect on Medusa's final moments, where she lays decapitated but leaves a legacy that far outlives her physical existence. her death, while it seems like the end, is really just a transition. In the myth, her severed head becomes one of the most powerful and revered artifacts in Greek mythology. The very power that turned her into a monster becomes a tool for the gods. This shift from a victim of punishment to a source of power is truly significant. Medusa's head isn't just a trophy for Perseus to claim. It is a symbol of the transformation that Medusa herself underwent, becoming something greater than she ever could have been if she had stayed in the world she once knew. The irony, however, is profound. Medusa's death, which on the surface might seem like a victory for Perseus, actually affirms the enduring power of her transformation. The gods, particularly Athena, now use her head, the object that was once a tool of terror, as a symbol of divine protection. In this sense, Medusa becomes immortal not through her death, but through her legacy, as her head is placed on Athena's shield, ensuring her presence in future battles, symbolizing both divine strength and an unyielding reminder of how power can be repurposed. In the realm of symbolism, Medusa's head represents more than just the curse and the terror it invoked. It serves as a reminder of how power can be both a weapon and a shield, how something born of tragedy can be repurposed into something that shapes the future. What began as an act of punishment by the gods becomes a powerful symbol of protection. In a twisted way, Medusa's story circles back to where it began. She was punished for something she had no control over, but in the end, she transformed that punishment into something that allowed her to persist beyond death. Her power, even in her death, was not diminished, it was only amplified. Medusa's legacy, as it extends into art, culture, and modern thought, reflects this complex interplay between victimhood and empowerment. Her myth, which starts with punishment and ends with her head being a symbol of strength, has been adopted by feminist movements, modern artists, and writers as a metaphor for the complex ways women have been punished for things beyond their control, only to later reclaim their power. Medusa is no longer just a monster. She's a symbol of survival, transformation, and defiance in the face of immense hardship. But let's not forget that Medusa was not the only figure in Greek mythology who was punished for circumstances beyond their control. Throughout mythology, many figures are similarly punished for their beauty, their desires, or even their mistakes. But what sets Medusa apart is the way she takes ownership of her transformation. Her curse could have easily made her a passive victim, lost to the cruel whims of the gods. But instead, Medusa evolves into something else, a figure of both terror and strength, one who refuses to be defined solely by her curse. And in a sense, her story is still being written. Every time someone reinterprets Medusa, whether through art, literature, or media, she becomes a new version of herself, always shifting, always transforming. From the earliest depictions of her as a monster to modern feminist interpretations of her as an empowered woman, Medusa is a myth that evolves with the times. Her image, whether as a monster with snakes for hair, a symbol of fear, or a figure of power, remains an enduring part of our cultural consciousness. So, what can we take away from Medusa's myth? Perhaps it's this: that even in the face of cruelty and isolation, there's always the potential for transformation. Even when life forces you into an identity you didn't choose, whether through tragedy, trauma, or hardship, there is always the potential to reclaim power. Medusa's story shows us that power isn't always given freely. Sometimes it must be taken, even when it comes from a place of pain. And perhaps, like Medusa, we can all find the strength to survive and grow, even when the odds seem insurmountable. In the end, Medusa's myth is a story of transformation, empowerment, and the constant battle between victimhood and strength. It's a story that speaks to anyone who has ever felt powerless, anyone who has faced adversity, and anyone who has found themselves changed by the circumstances around them. Medusa's journey is one of reclaiming control, of taking something destructive and turning it into something powerful. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson we can learn from her, that even in our darkest moments, we can find the power to change, to grow, and to reclaim our story. So, as we close the book on Medusa's tale, remember that she's more than just a monster or a myth. She is a symbol of transformation, of the complex ways in which power is shaped by pain and strength, and how even in the most difficult circumstances, we have the ability to reshape our own fate. Medusa may have been cursed, but in the end, she became more than just a victim. She became a symbol of resilience, power, and defiance.